All right, music fans, welcome back. Harmless Dave here, talking real music in real time for real people just like you and just like me. In this segment, we're talking more than just music. We're talking about a radio legend. I think it was back in 1992. I had quit my job in radio. The station I was working at was bought out and flipped their format to oldies. And I wasn't ready to be an oldies disc jockey. I was still working at the music store. I still had my weekend gigs at the nightclubs. So I had enough money to survive for a while. But my life trajectory would radically change in the years after that. And one of the things I'll never forget is I'm on the beach. And Cape Cod, you've got a lot of quality beaches. And I'm sitting there on the beach. It's the middle of summer. And I'm listening to the radio. And I'm trying to basically find a really good radio station, right? So, I'm getting a lot of static. And then this booming voice comes over the airwaves. And I'm like, who the heck is this guy? So I started listening. Not only was this guy really good at radio, but he had the perfect radio voice. But he's talking about politics, and he's talking about left and right and Republicans and Democrats. And up until that point, I think I was really agnostic when it came to politics. I had a lot of friends that were kind of political, or they'd have a cause that they were all for, anti-nukes or whatever it was. And I'd be like, yeah, that's cool, dude. I'd just like go along with it and say, yeah, good for you, But as time went on, that is listening to this guy bloviate, I started to get angry because I knew he was saying stuff that my friends wouldn't agree with. But the more I listened, the more I started to understand that this was something different. This was something new that I had never heard before. He was saying things that people in talk radio or the news media don't say. And so I became really intrigued with it. And I would say by the second hour of listening, because the thing was totally addictive, I had given up, trying to find a music radio station. And I kept listening to this guy, and I went from angry to kind of complacent. And then by the end of it, totally enthralled. This guy was entertaining. He was provocative. He was funny. He did these little skits and bits during the broadcast, and I hadn't heard anything done like that, so on the fly, but all put together so well. And it turns out by the end of it, I was like, he's got a few points here that are pretty good. And a lot of stuff that he talked about, I had never known, I had never heard before. So that was like my great awakening, my great turning into the world of political discourse. Of course, I'm talking about the one and only, the late, great Rush Limbaugh, who passed away a year ago today. Rush died of a very aggressive form of cancer. He smoked cigarettes. If you throw Google out there and you find out, cause of death, and you're basically going to hear from people who hated Limbaugh, who are going to say, hey, he got what he deserved. He smoked. He never regretted what he did. And that's the thing about Rush. He was kind of a libertarian when it came to his own life. He was married 3 times. He smoked a lot of cigarettes. He smoked a lot of quality cigars. He ate a lot of really good quality steaks. He used to advertise on his show. I remember it was like Ruth's Chris Steakhouse or whatever it was called. And he made everything sound like it was the greatest thing in the world. That is just the sign of a great, artist, a great performer, and a great announcer. Prior to Limbaugh's talk radio stint, he was a disc jockey, and he liked being a disc jockey. He loved music. So he's a man after my own heart. What's even more interesting is that there is one song that's out there that I think represents Rush Limbaugh like no other song. And it's a song he adopted for the show, which was supposed to make fun of and mock the people who he was constantly at war with. Those were the crazy environmentalists, He used to call them environmentalist wackos. And he decided to use this song called My City Was Gone by the Pretenders. And the Pretenders, for me, was a band that I loved. 1980s, the early Pretenders work was more like post-punk, new wave, the first two albums. And then they lose James Honeyman Scott, who, if I remember, OD'd from cocaine. And that was really rough for that band at that time. They continued on, and they dropped this two-sided single with Back on the Chain Gang on one side and My City Was Gone on the other side. And I remember getting that 45 and thinking to myself, okay, these guys have gone next level. This isn't like their old stuff. And I loved their first two albums, especially songs like, Brass in Pocket and Stop Your Sobbing. But there were other tracks throughout those first two albums, I thought, that showed that the band had even more potential. But I think they needed to kind of leave their post-punk sound behind, because you had this very provocative and interesting vocal with Chrissie Hynde. And James Honeyman Scott was a great guitar player. But on these tracks, on these two tracks, you had the likes of Billy Bremner on guitar playing one of the most tasty solos that you're ever going to hear on My City Was Gone. In addition, this guy, Tony Butler, with his bass exercise, right? The beginning of that song is so recognizable because of what Tony Butler does on bass. And apparently this was like a warm-up exercise for him, much like what Kerry Livgren did on Dust in the Wind. This was like a guitar exercise, where in Butler's case, this was something he would do to warm up. And what a bass line. That bass line is legendary. And couple that with Bremner's guitar work. Bremner, an alumni of the Dave Edmunds era, Rockpile, Nick Lowe. They couldn't have chosen two stronger studio musicians to go in there and record this song. And Limbaugh, having the great ear that he had prior to his hearing loss, decided this is going to be the theme song. I'm going to mock these people that I don't like, and I'm going to have this amazing intro that I can talk over. And of course, they cut all the vocal parts out and they made it into an instrumental track. And to this day, when I hear that song, it just reminds me that the show is about to start. The show is about to start. I can go listen in some weird market at midnight and hear the Rush Limbaugh show begin to start, because that song is so iconic. And when you hear that, you're thinking Rush is about to talk. And for a little while, there was a dispute, whereas the people who were in charge of licensing the song decided that Limbaugh shouldn't have access to it because he was mocking it. He was making fun of it. And he obviously didn't share the same politics as Chrissie Hynde. Well, what's really a great story here is how the world used to work. So Chrissie Hynde got wind of the fact that her people were preventing Limbaugh from using the song. During that time, I think Limbaugh actually used Stranglehold a couple of times by Ted Nugent. I love the song, but it didn't work as the show intro. You needed that iconic bass line and that incredible, tasty lead guitar work. That is the perfect intro to a radio show. So Chrissie Hynde gets wind of all this, and she says, look, my parents are huge fans of the show. True story. Her parents loved the Rush Limbaugh show. And then she made this deal with Rush. She said, look, you can keep playing the song as your intro. And keep in mind, that means hundreds of radio stations across the country airing the song every day, multiple times during the day. Why wouldn't you want to do that? But she said to Rush, hey, if you donate a portion of the proceeds, to, from your show, whatever it is, however she arranged that, to PETA, which is the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, we'll go ahead and let you use the song. Rush decided to do it. All right. Even though that kind of flew in the face of everything that Rush was talking about at the time. I think he coined the phrase people eating tasty animals. But they were using chemicals on animals during animal testing. And I think all of us have come a long way to realize that that's a cause. In fact, they're using chemicals now on human beings in trials for certain medications. And there doesn't seem to be any recourse for that. So Chrissie Hynde, maybe in her radical environmentalist wacko kind of way, ends up being right. Just like the people who opposed the Vietnam War, there were a lot of good causes that people who say didn't want their son or daughter killed in a war, or didn't want a dog or cat or whatever animal experimented on. People across the political spectrum now, I think, agree that, maybe we shouldn't be doing these kinds of experiments on humans and on animals. Anyway, Limbaugh decided to go along with it. The song was restored as the theme song. And to this day, it is just, when I hear that song, I think of Rush Limbaugh. I think of all of those great voiceovers when that song is still playing in the background and he's ramping up to some big thought that he's about to present. For those people who loved Limbaugh, he was like comfort food every day. For those people who were worried about the world and what the media had been saying prior to Limbaugh getting on the air, Limbaugh would typically counter and tell everybody that things are going to be okay. He was reassuring. He was informative. And most of the time he was right. I'm not saying all the time, but he was right more often than he wasn't. He used to say this thing like 99.7% correct, 98% of the time. He'd come up with these things. In fact, for the record, people, Harmless Dave is a direct reference to Rush when he used to say, "I'm a harmless little fuzzball." All right. So that's my little way of paying tribute to a man who changed radio. He changed how we discussed politics. Typically, he wasn't mean-spirited. Typically, he said what he believed, and he opened up a cottage industry for everybody who does a podcast, everybody who's got a talk show, all of these YouTubers that came along later. I mean, that was Rush Limbaugh. He started that revolution. There was really no talk radio prior to Rush. I mean, there was community service programming, which is like watching paint dry. It's really boring. Okay, Limbaugh came along, made it entertaining. And guess what day part he used? Live, 12 to 3 Eastern. That's ridiculous. Any radio programmer worth their salt would have told you, no. There's nobody going to listen to this. Everybody's at work. You got housewives maybe, or you got people who are, domestic, whatever, and they're not gonna listen. But yet Limbaugh decided that this was going to work, and then it started to catch fire. In fact, at lunchtime in certain cities, they had these Rush rooms, which were devoted. They were dedicated to people who were taking their lunch break, and they wanted to go in and listen to Limbaugh, maybe have a nice cigar, or maybe eat their lunch, or do whatever, they wanted to do. Because Rush was all about, hey, free choice, you can do what you want. So in any event, he wasn't perfect. Nobody is perfect, but he did, I think, in the end, get the, the Presidential Medal of Freedom right before he passed away, not too long before that. And he got a rousing standing ovation from people who were decent, The other people sat, but I think they knew that this guy was an icon of a movement. In fact, a lot of people on the left were able to do radio and be equal time to Rush Limbaugh during the programming day on a lot of radio stations. Now, a lot of those radio shows didn't do all that well, but it did open up the medium for people who had differing views who also wanted to do talk radio. The bottom line is nobody did talk radio like Rush Limbaugh, and no song in history, at least in my view, had as much impact as My City Was Gone to basically fuse together with the entire Rush Limbaugh persona, the show, everything about it. So that was a perfect song for a fairly perfect radio show by a very imperfect but humble and decent guy. And everybody who does talk radio, who does podcasting, who does YouTubing, they owe a debt of gratitude to Rush Limbaugh, who is a radio legend and who's been gone now for 1 year. So in any event, that's my attempt at paying tribute to Rush Limbaugh, that harmless little fuzzball from one harmless guy to another.